everyone. Thanks for being here. My name is Dylan Zavagno. I'm the Adult Services Coordinator at the Deerfield Public Library, and I host interviews with authors, artists, and academics on the Deerfield Public Library podcast. On that podcast feed, each June since 2021, we've hosted Queer Poem a Day, a daily poetry podcast and program series at the library, co-founded and co-directed by myself and poet and professor Lisa Hiton. This is our capstone lecture that Lisa and I do every year, where we sort of sum up the themes we saw from the year and offer our readings of these fabulous poems. And I'm actually going to refer to some older years too. So I'll get started with my portion of the talk in just a minute, and then we'll turn it over to Lisa. But before I start, I just want to remind everyone that you can find all of our poems at deerfieldlibrary.org/queerpoemaday, or find the Deerfield Public Library podcast anywhere you get podcasts, including Apple Podcasts, Spotify, etc. I also want to say a huge thank you to Zoe, our social media coordinator, Steph, our communications manager, assistant director Melissa, and director Amy at the library. And a huge thank you to the Friends of the Deerfield Public Library and the Village's Deerfield Fine Arts Commission. They have once again sponsored this program by funding it. The Village also highlighted our program again in its proclamation of June as Pride Month. So I want to say a bit about the structure of Queer Poem a Day for the last few years. Our first 2 years, we brought you 30 poems actually every single day in June. Our third year, we switched up the format and went Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and had longer episodes. It was Lineage Edition. So we asked poets to read a work of lineage, followed by a little explanation or some thoughts, and then a poem of their own. And I'm really proud of the kind of educational aspect of that year. So check that out. This year, we returned to mostly our original format. We shared 20 poems on every weekday in June. The poets we invite send us anything they want, new or previously published. And aside from that lineage year, and even then, we really didn't have any guidelines or restrictions. So the sort of self-definition that emerged also had some weird coincidences or shared concerns emerge, and perhaps I might suggest, at least for me in my reading, a poetic community has developed. So I'm going to start by saying this, that I think Lisa and I venture to say maybe many of our poets have a not uncomplicated relationship to the identity politics implicit in this project, depending, of course, on how you define that term. Nevertheless, whether by the process of turning life into poetry, or if there's any difference or uniqueness in turning queer life into poetry, nevertheless, we found shared themes emerge. Basically, this is the way some of these poems hit my ears. So I urge you to find your own meanings. And again, I drew from all of our years to find some of these coincidences and themes and connections and intergenerational themes. And this is sort of my own labor to understand what our collection of poems over the last 4 years represents. Our first big coincidence that we had was from our first year, when both Rachel Mennes and Richie Hoffman sent us poems with a shared image. Richie's was, this is from his poem Male Beauty, featured in his book 100 Lovers. The end of the poem is, "In my favorite recordings, you can hear the pianist breathing." Now, in Rachel Mennes's poem, Unsent Draft, from her book, The Naomi Letters, she starts her poem by saying, "Last night, Naomi, I typed piano music where you can hear the pianist breathing into my browser." So we had kind of assumed this was a direct inspiration. Rachel and Richie know each other well. They read each other's work. it wasn't until I interviewed Rachel about the Naomi letters in a long form interview for the podcast that she said, no, this just was an image they both happened upon separately. So, what does this mean? Of course, we loved the resonance with the music from our series, where pianist Daniel Baer chooses and performs a piece each year by an LGBTQIA plus composer and performs it. But there is perhaps a shared interest from these poetic speakers in finding that extra human presence, finding the poet's medium of breath, which might turn into speech, existing alongside the hands playing the piano. This is something like what Richard Seiken does in his new poem Cover Story. Our fourth poem shared on this fourth year. I'm going to read the opening of Cover Story. My boyfriend did not die in 1991. I told a lie, and it turned into a fact, forever repeated in my official biography. He died on Christmas Day, 1990, when his family disconnected the mechanical breathing machine. He was a composer in the School of Music. We were working on a piece for voice and strings. I liked writing the words under the whole notes, hyphenating them to make them last. A poem is sort of a mechanical breathing machine that does make things last. In this case, the speaker is correcting the record by adding the missing words and music. Of course, even though it's a prose poem, music is still key. Think of those repeated, that rhyme there. My boyfriend did not die. I told a lie. So Seiken adds the missing words that will reveal the falsity of the cover story. Something like that might obviously be of interest to many queer writers. Of course, there are a lot of uneasy ambivalences in not only trying to represent your identity, but representing that act of pulling off the covers, that kind of metaphor of coming out, when poetry also wants to hide. So as I read the lines from Cindy Zhuang Oak's brilliant poem Claim that we also featured this year, there's a kind of maybe exhaustion and some wonder that she notes when she says, some of us here are lanterns, representing things always. We add another kind of layer of unease or ambivalence and a narrative of that fear and bravery of the act of speaking, found in Eduardo C. Corral's title poem of his 2020 collection, Guillotine, our second poem we shared this year. I'm just going to read the opening on your screen here. This is, it's not the full poem. It keeps going on. Guillotine. The scorpions always arrive at dawn. Gently, their pincers touch the cuts on my lips. I clutch the edges of the mattress, stare at the mirrored ceiling. My mouth opens, but no sound staggers out. The scorpions, dark green, dank, reach in, pull out the razor blade under my tongue. Two scorpions, a razor blade. Slowly in unison, without letting go of the metal, they move. A guillotine making its way down my body. I can't help but hear not only the speaker of the poem's own personal predicament, but for me at least, the backdrop of increasing challenges to the voice, say to library collections and programs about and for the queer public. More ambivalence, or feeling that kind of not really being able to speak, but speaking anyway, can be found in Leslie Sines' poem, our third poem for the year, titled appropriately, At the Center of the Story and Utterly Left Out. It imagines Rudolph Valentino, a favorite of the poem's dedicatee and addressee, who is the very tragic figure of Elena Milagro de Hoyos. So her favorite of Rudolph Valentino says in the poem, this is from a middle section here, not the full poem on the screen. I feel quite unreal, he said once, maybe twice, into a beautiful microphone. Into our beautiful podcast microphones, there's another kind of related thread that I want to pull out here. For our first poem this year, our fourth year, we were honored to be the first publication of Jason B. Crawford's poem Untitled, 1975 to 86. This poem takes its title, and it's actually a series that Jason has written, and takes its title after this series of photographs who all have that title by the photographer Alvin Baltrop, who is an African-American photographer who took photographs of the queer men on the Hudson Piers, which in those mostly pre-AIDS years in New York were cruising zones, community places, and sites of art installations. The photographs and the poem illuminate a lost world, and one that also seems to speak to our present and our present ambivalences about pride and representation in a world where safety and documentation and remembrance, which is sort of the pillars of Lisa and I's project here, are not easily promised. This poem opens, I'll read the first few lines here. I don't know if we will all make it to June. We are already so tired. Sexton said something like this once, then lived until October, leaves drying around her feet. Am I afraid to live that long? I am afraid to let June be the marker for us, the dead bodies piling like sloppily laid bricks. For Crawford, their speaker is explicitly referencing Anne Sexton's famous line in her poem about her parents' deaths. The truth the dead know. And you can see the dedications right there for my mother when she died, for my father when he died just several months after in June. And her line is, "It is June. I am tired of being brave." Sexton's poem and Crawford's poem take us back to our very first year and the very first poem we opened with in 2021, Shelley Wong's poem, Pride Month, which also uses that same line from Sexton as anaphora, as repeated refrain. It is June. And it also, curiously, like Crawford's poem, refers to those very same peers, but in another era. So this is not Baltrop's era. This is an era of corporate-sponsored Pride dance parties and many other years of Pride, including the Pulse shooting. And in all of these prides in Shelley's poem, exhaustion and bravery both need expression. I'm going to read the opening here and then maybe the ending too of Shelley's poem, Pride Month. It is June, and I read about having grace to forgive those who would condemn us. It is June, and a man reads a poem where the father becomes a dying stag, and the son says, "There is something I need to tell you." It is June, when I was awake past midnight, gathering news about the Pulse nightclub shooting. I fell asleep, knowing I would wake to walk against grief in waves. It is June, and I am happy that Tegan and Sarah will appear in San Francisco or Oakland. It is June, and I have never prayed to any god. It was New York in the 2000s when my ex ran the backstage chaos at the Pride Pier dance. We slid through a sea of men with shaved chests. The songs hardly had words, and the bass shuddered into our bodies. Fireworks climaxed over the Hudson, and the crowd rocked and roared back. I stood in a tropical sundress in the VIP section, surrounded by so many barely dressed people, double kissing my face, saying, "Happy Pride," and "Where is your wife?" I had to read the whole poem. It's so good. So in Shelley's poem, there's a certain wit that comes into play, that ironically missing lover asked after at the end of the poem, who may not yet even be legally allowed to be called wife, if that matters. This made me think of Louise Glick. We did several tribute programs to Louise this year. Glick was, of course, not a member of the LGBTQIA plus community, but was a student of Lisa, or sorry, was a teacher of Lisa Hiton's, and a friend, teacher, and colleague to many of our participating poets over the past years, and some of our interview poets on our regular podcast episodes. And there's this sort of lineage of wit and candor, as she famously, Gluck says in her poem October. It is true, there is not enough beauty in the world. It is also true that I am not competent to restore it. Neither is there candor, and here I may be of some use. And this kind of use of candor that poets might be able to do, I also found in sort of a different way in Amelia Otta's work, which has a kind of candor, and by candor by way of impudent wit, I might say. There's sort of a dose of fun on top of the exhaustion of bravery. And this also echoes Shelley Wong's line about not being able to understand the words. This is an excerpt of a forthcoming book-length poem called Hard and Glad. And this is a little section of the section that Amelia read on our podcast. I'm going to read this section and pay attention for this killer, witty, and candor-filled last line. Exquisitely existing, an abundance of light and heat and play. Don't understand the words, instead the rhythm, instead the thigh, the calf, the pit. No part ignored in the common way, none left unlicked. Such fruitful misapprehensions, abundant, abound, and I agree they embed with me. The world does seem precipitously bright. Play well, play it well, play it fairly well. And we who live here for a time play fairly well. For too long I played too poorly. The tongue cannot live on vowels alone. Neither can, nor I can, nor how soon the moon, and it's blindly fleeing. Let me recite it exquisitely. It exquisitely. Exhaustion and wit and fun. You got to hear Amelia read it, especially. There's a lot of fun there. And now some more fun and playful language and another full circle moment this year. Back in year 2, we had Spencer Reese give us a remarkable previously unpublished poem, Humpty Dumpty, which was dedicated to Mark Wunderlich, the poet. And Spencer's poem included the line, "I am a stonewall mirror ball." Now, in year 4, Mark Wunderlich himself speaks no horses to maybe no audience and gives us some existential fun. I think I'll read the whole poem here. No horse. No horse, no piebald Sicilian donkey, no baby goats gamboling on an old cable spool, no cat fat and shedding by the stove, no rooster plumed and cartoonish, dashing about the yard, putting a hole in my shin with his spur, no rescued cur, no teacup Pomeranian afraid to walk on grass, piddling on a pea pad like a god. No god either, for that matter, no father. He's all ash. Now mother makes a hash of her checkbook. When she last drove, a small crash. The guinea pigs of childhood whistle from their graveyard at the dump. Jeed, that lascivious Frenchie must hump some other chump. No sheep weep on hilly bourne. No son, not even a little one. No girl curled on gay papa's lap. No way to stop what I've started here. Just steer the goddamn big car. Look out, I shout out the window, but no one hears. Who hears anyway? Who's here anyway? As I read it, so many of the poets this year, in particular, ask themselves what it means to be part of a community, part of an identity, a self, speaking in the world that hears and doesn't hear the voice of poetry, or maybe the voice of queer poetry. So finally, a meditation by Esther Lynn, Praise the Scaffold in Rouen Cathedral, which I take to be imagining the speaker herself as a kind of construction scaffolding. And I just love and can't stop thinking about this metaphor. My teaching background makes me think of scaffolding in a classroom where you would slowly take away the supports from a student so they would learn to complete a task themselves, or maybe an interpretive task themselves. Here it's a scaffold to repair a church, implicitly a community, a scaffold that's exterior. It's obviously obscuring yet protecting and preserving the beauty of the architecture. I'm going to I'll read the whole poem too. Praise the Scaffold in Rouen Cathedral. This bony spider, legs astride the burrow, it is a master, a myth of warning to those who approach its many feet, installed by bolt and plate among altars to Saint Melonius, Richard the Lionheart, the first dukes of Normandy, and God. Steadfast as the church, this scaffold debuts after each fire and drop bomb of the centuries to allow study, restoration, and caress. The scaffold is the hero of the church, else a charwoman who performs swiftly with apology to the host and in contempt of his guests. The god of this church is Saturn, who sires and dines upon his get whenever he is wounded. While the scaffold nourishes the god, it knows it is immortal. It and the god are locked in fleshy meld. I don't know how to pronounce the cinquefoil. Tracery, the fluted column. They belong to a clarity of mind. We must admire, but the scaffold is a matter of instant recognition. I am that scaffold, as all children of complicated parents are, as we labor to understand and then provide. And of course, that last line makes me think of our labor to understand and then provide a documentation, a memory, a collection, a community. It is June, and I'm exhausted, tired of being brave, having exquisite fun. And now I'm going to remove the scaffold and let the poetry stand on its own. So thank you. That's my portion of the talk. And we will turn this over to Lisa.
Hi, everybody. I have no slides as usual. And luckily, even though Dylan and I have not discussed it, we touch on many of the same poems, but in completely and utterly different ways. So I'll be excited to hear what you all think. Um, I'll just say, this is our fourth year of doing capstones, and it's amazing how every year there's always something totally different to talk about in the poems that gathered. And this year, doing the format slightly differently of just having weekdays and no weekends. It felt like when Dylan and I were putting the order together that they really functioned as four separate little movements. And it made for great music, I think. So today's capstone is called Siphoning the Self, the poetic eye and the theater of the self. Where do we come from? What are we? Where are we going? Unlike other literary arts, poetry's most manipulative and violating tool is the role of the eye. A reader must become the eye of the poem, no matter what predicament the speaker is in. The reader who is most engaged in this effort will find themselves lost in the psyche and longing devised by that poet's speaker. This intimacy between the reader and the page, the stage where time and consciousness elide reality, is where we stand to change the self. Thus, leaving the poem can be a kind of tonic, either a healing element or the first note in a new scale. The season's poems bring us into the great theater of the self. At the center of the story and utterly left out by Leslie Sines, the speaker begins with consciousness as elemental. I thoughts, all any of us have. If there is first noise or nothingness in the mind, which is mirrored by the white noise of a blank page, then the first arrival of self in that field is the I indeed. Sines frames the I, too, as being contronym, both center of the story and utterly left out. That thinking element gets to be central to the inner life, perhaps especially when we otherwise might be left out, might need to protest to be seen or heard or belong. Voice is not always earnest, though, especially in the arts. In Richard Siken's poem, Cover Story, the speaker begins by announcing their untrustworthiness. My boyfriend did not die in 1991. I told a lie, and it turned into a fact, forever repeated in my official biography. He died on Christmas Day, 1990, when his family disconnected the mechanical breathing machine. The speaker begins by admitting he has lied. He also does this by presenting the lie first, that by saying when his boyfriend did not die, the reader has to first imagine the wrong timeline in order to erase or correct it. The speaker confesses to us, which is a trustworthy act, but the speaker has lied to the masses, and perhaps even to the self. Did the speaker mean to lie? Did he even know that he did? He was a composer in a school of music. We were working on a piece for voice and strings. I liked writing the words under the whole notes, hyphenating them to make them last. Where the speaker's boyfriend has just been undone from mechanical breathing, from a noisy kind of voicelessness. The speaker's grief restores the image with a truer, hidden intimacy, the making of music together. Where the boyfriend would be responsible for the strings, the liar, the speaker gets to bring in the words, the voice, the other liar. Though music is literal, though the notes last as long as written in the time prescribed, this speaker longs for something more. making both the words and the music last through hyphenation, joining strings and voice, joining the lovers in their grammatical gestures. And yet a hyphen can also be used for division of a word or for the absence of an element. The speaker goes on to unveil that the boyfriend was in a car accident, that the family didn't know about him, about them. To have been the center of the story in one room, then utterly left out in another. To have the machinery of instruments play and your voices in one room, then to be ended by the machinations of a hospital bed. If the fact of the things becoming lies, then what of the feeling of them? He hadn't told his family, and it didn't seem right to tell them now, to suggest that they didn't really know him. And yet the reader gets to know both parties in this confessional space. I don't mean confessional here as a poetic mode, but rather one of the theater. That Hiton gives us the speaker's utterance as a prose poem makes it feel and look like a letter, like a soliloquy. That to us, the speaker is trustworthy because we are here to hear. What does a cover story cover up anyways? In Hiton's poem, we're coaxed at the onset to think we're covering up a lie about a fact. In the end, we are covering up much more grave matters, sending the boyfriend to death without unbearing the truth of his life. We're covering up the evidence. This complexly captures the grief and vast distance between living freely in queer love and in queer bodies and privacy, between what others might know and our deepest I thoughts. The stage of the self is taken most literally in Esther Lynn's Praise the Scaffold at Rouen Cathedral. The scaffold itself is made metaphor from the onset. This bony spider, legs astride the burrow, it is a master, a myth of warning to those who approach its many feet. Metaphor is the ultimate tool to take the reader in the seat of the I and connive them into becoming and feeling something other than their own selfhood. The speaker and reader here are scaffold, then immediately arachnid. In the world of this poem, that makes us all master. We are both looking at the object and taking on its powers from this position. The speaker and reader are in a position to heed the warning and mythos of the object. The object is also a poem, a many-footed voice, doling out myth and warning at the break of each line. Steadfast as the church, this scaffold debuts after each fire and dropped bomb of the centuries to allow study, restoration, and caress. Scaffold comes from the Middle English for a temporary stage, one from which to repair or erect a building, to raise something or repair it. Study, restoration, caress. These are the main gestures we are capable of as artists and as a species. The scaffold is the hero for now. Once the cathedral is restored, it will walk its many feet out of the scene, and the temporary stage where selfhood is performed in costume, metaphor, disguise, will siphon itself off and away. A scaffold is also a stage upon which death is enacted. In Eduardo C. Corral's poem Guillotine, the danger of voice is both literal and metaphorical. When scorpions arrive to the speaker's room at dawn, the speaker has no agency to fight them. My mouth opens, but no sound staggers out. If only the speaker had a voice. If only the speaker could stop violence. In the absence of voice, the speaker must find a way to protect the self. The blade, a threat, a reminder. It's my task to stop yearning. If the queer self is at the center of the story, it is in danger. If the longing stops, perhaps the body will not be as close to death. My thoughts swerve from monsoon storms to accordions to pecan groves. The little guillotine starts moving again. I begin to sense the enormity of my body, the blade high in the air, for now. Thoughts can swerve, especially when we are in danger. It is the great power of poetry to turn that swerve into a concrete piece of lyric, full of many feet, making it all myth. Our season begins with a nod to Sexton and Jason B. Crawford's untitled 1975 to 86, and it ends tomorrow by communing with Sappho in Mary Jo Bang's poem, Mary Jo in the time of Sappho. Along the way, our poets have recited their visions of selfhood, as Amelia Ada puts it exquisitely. It is important that whether our speakers are using the ocean to describe an erotic encounter, French idiom to become a peach from hell, imagining male pregnancy, taking saffron to be as thin and fragile as our wishes, but then letting it dye the entirety of selfhood into another color, fragrance, essence, that being exquisite is both especially beautiful and radical. In Before Light, Matthew Gelman's speaker begins with a wish. I am thinking of the sister I wish I had, red hair spilling over the sedan's black seat. Speaker longs for a sister, then he imagines her being sped away in a car, her finger hooked in the hole burned into the seat by someone's boyfriend's ash, her head tilted back, lulled by the driver's junky radio. Nothing's gonna hurt you, baby, as long as you're with me. So far, the scene is only implying a danger lurking by longing. Even now, years of trying to see her, striding into dusk, all before light, all promise, her dress a galloping of small yellow wings, my mind still delivers me only this, that group of boys killing their engine and doing to her under the cedar's nimbus things I will not say in this poem. The speaker longs for a sister, but it's a lie. He wishes to have been carried away, like that red-haired figure in the sedan at the beginning. How even now I can feel a small finger twisting my throat when I try to tell it, if I were to tell it completely, if I had a sister to tell. To be the center of a story or myth that happens to others, but not to him. To be the center of an exquisite story in the poem, but to be exiled in the memory, under the cedar and in the pool. These voices have taken on Sexton, Sappho, Story, Sisters, Scorpions, Scaffold, Smythe, and many other forms of seeking the self in the body and in other sounds and objects. For me, they make the tonic we need to heal as selves and as a collection of selves as we leave the pages and airwaves and head back into the world. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Lisa. That was wonderful. I'm so amazed by some of the other sounds that you didn't note in your essay of siphon, psyche, psychen, which is a nice little rhyme there. If anyone has any questions or comments, we'll stay on for a couple minutes. But thank you all for listening, reading, participating in our programs. It's really been a great pleasure this year. So thank you.
Thank you.